Hi, I'm Rhett. The night they kicked me out, my mother didn't even look me in the eye. My father just tossed a crumpled dollar in my lap and said, "Go survive with the trash." No coat, no goodbye, no place to go. But what they didn't know was that my grandmother, the only person who ever truly saw me, had already left behind something they never could steal: an old, beat-up card, and a secret vault with more money than they could ever imagine. And when the bank manager saw the balance and locked the doors to protect me, that's when I realized this wasn't just survival anymore. It was war. But what would you do if your own family forged your name, stole your life, and smiled while they buried the truth? Stay with me. You need to hear what they did next. I remember the way the air felt that afternoon, thick enough to taste, yet somehow colder than it should have been for early summer in Lubbock. What cut through me wasn't the heat. It was the sound of my father's voice calling my name like he was done pretending I still belonged in his house. When I stepped into the living room, both of them were standing there, stiff, impatient, like I'd shown up late to my own removal. My mother didn't even look at me. My father just pointed toward the garage and said I needed to clear my things and make space. I didn't argue. I should have, maybe. Instead, I walked out to the garage thinking it was another one of those moments they'd cool off from. I still believed a son in his 30s meant something to them. But then he followed me out and dropped a single dollar into my hand. "Go survive with the trash out there," he muttered, not even trying to hide the contempt. That line didn't land like a blow. It fell more like confirmation of something I'd felt for years, but never wanted to name. He reached for a beat-up cardboard box on the shelf and tossed it toward me. It burst open when it hit the floor, spilling out a mess of old magazines, a broken flashlight, and a chipped mug that wasn't mine. Nothing in that box belonged to me. It wasn't clearing my things. It was dumping whatever they didn't want to carry into the next phase of their lives. I bent down to gather the pieces, and when I lifted my head, I caught two neighbors glancing over. They froze for a second, then looked away like turning their heads could erase what they saw. I don't blame them. Nobody wants to witness a family fracture in broad daylight. I kept the box under my arm and walked back inside, careful, quiet, trying to make sense of what was happening. If I had said the wrong thing earlier, I couldn't remember what it was. I went straight to the hallway closet, to the folder where I always kept my important documents: birth certificate, social security card, old bank papers. The folder wasn't there. The space where it used to sit was empty, dust outlining the shape as if it had been taken hours earlier. My mother was leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, her face unreadable. "It's gone," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. My father, still in the garage, shouted back, "You never had anything worth keeping." That line echoed louder than the one about the trash. This wasn't an argument. It wasn't anger. This was removal. Clean and final. I stood in that hallway for a moment longer, long enough for the truth to settle. This wasn't sudden. Families don't collapse in a single afternoon. They crack piece by piece. Every time I was told to let it go, every time they said, "You're the easy one," every time I was expected to bend so the others didn't have to, this moment had been building. I just hadn't wanted to see it. When I stepped outside again, I slipped my hand into my pocket and felt the old iron key my grandmother gave me before she passed. A small, rusty thing she told me to keep because one day it'll matter. I used to think it was just her way of giving a sentimental keepsake, But I held it tighter now. It was the single object I had left that felt like it came from love rather than obligation. I sat down on the curb, the sun lowering behind the trees, the light turning everything the color of faded copper. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have identification or a home to walk back into, or even a box of belongings that were mine. But for the first time, I wasn't trying to reason with their silence. I wasn't trying to fix anything. You learn a lot from the way people choose not to speak. I stayed there until the shadows stretched long enough to remind me the day wasn't going to wait for me to collect myself. I stood, picked up the empty box, slipped the dollar into my pocket next to the key, and started toward the road. Maybe I looked like a man just taking an evening walk, but I knew better. This was the day my family decided I was disposable. What they didn't realize was that the thing they dismissed, this old key, would become the turning point in everything. The wind picked up a little as I kept walking, brushing dust from the edge of the street onto my shoes. The key was still in my pocket, the dollar folded inside my palm, warm from my grip. I didn't have a destination, just a direction, a way. That was enough for now. The sidewalks were quiet, most porches already dimming for the evening. I passed the cracked pavement where I'd learned to ride a bike as a kid, the storm drain where I once lost my favorite toy car. Funny how memory clings to the small things. I walked slower than I needed to, maybe hoping someone, anyone, would come out and say this had gone too far, that it was a mistake, but no one did. I was almost past the Hendricks house when I heard the voice. "Rhett? Honey? Everything okay?" Mrs. Hendricks was standing at the edge of her lawn, arms wrapped around herself like she wasn't sure if she was intruding or being neighborly. She was kind, always had been. She used to sneak me cookies when I was a kid, said I looked like I needed something sweet in a bitter house. I opened my mouth to answer her, but then my father's voice cut through the quiet. "He's fine, Judy," he called out from the front porch behind me. His tone was sharp, performative. "Just taking off again, like always. Says he's a grown man, but acts like the world owes him something." I froze, my jaw clenched. He wasn't talking to me. He was broadcasting, loud enough for everyone on the street to hear. "Some boys just never grow up," he added, almost laughing. I didn't look back. I didn't give him the scene he was baiting me for. I saw Mrs. Hendricks's face change. Not pity, exactly. Something quieter. Embarrassed for me. She nodded, as if trying to politely step out of it, and said softly, "I hope you sort things out, Rhett." I gave a slight nod and kept walking, but something in me curled up. That moment, that twisting of the truth in front of someone who meant well, was worse than the box or the dollar. He didn't just throw me out of his house. He rewrote the reason I left. And now someone else would carry that version forward. I've learned something about humiliation. It doesn't always come in shouts. Sometimes it comes in quiet edits, in how your story is retold by the people who hurt you, and how quickly others accept that version. I didn't speak, not because I couldn't, but because if I'd tried to defend myself right there, it would have sounded like exactly what he said I was. Emotional, unstable, weak. I walked to the end of the block, then crossed the street toward the bus stop. I didn't check the schedule. I didn't care where the bus was going. I just needed to be somewhere that wasn't here. About 20 minutes later, I stepped off near the Walmart on Slide Road. It was bright, open, and anonymous. I hadn't eaten, hadn't sat down in hours. I walked in slow, head down, grabbed a cart just to blend in. I wasn't here to buy anything. I just Needed a place to exist for a while. The fluorescent lights hummed above me as I made slow laps through the aisles. My legs ached. I passed rows of cereal, garden hoses, Father's Day cards. Everything looked like it belonged to someone else's life. I finally settled in the clearance section near the back, beside a rack of discounted Halloween decorations they hadn't bothered to pack away yet. I pulled out my phone. No new messages, no missed calls. I opened my notes app and started listing what I'd lost. Birth certificate, gone. Social security card, gone. Bank documents, gone. Health insurance, tax ID, student loan logins, gone. It hit me harder than I expected. I wasn't just locked out of my parents' house. I was locked out of my own name. You don't think about how much of your life depends on a few slips of paper until they're gone. It's not just about money. You can't apply for housing, jobs, utilities, anything. You can't even prove you are who you say you are. And when that loss comes not from theft by strangers, but from your own parents, it makes you question if you were ever more than an inconvenience they finally had the nerve to erase. I sat on the bench just outside the pharmacy, staring at nothing. Walmart at night has a strange rhythm. Parents dragging tired kids, teenagers goofing off near the electronics, a couple arguing quietly near the frozen dinners. Nobody notices the guy who's been in the same aisle for 30 minutes without buying a thing. Eventually, I went to the restroom and locked myself in the farthest stall. I didn't cry. I couldn't. My chest felt too tight for that. I sat there staring at the metal door in front of me, feeling like the floor underneath me had quietly dropped away. I wasn't panicking. I was unraveling, quietly, methodically, alone. I reached into my pocket at one point and felt the outline of the key. I didn't take it out. I wasn't thinking about it just then, but I held it without realizing, like some part of me knew I needed to anchor to something, anything that wasn't gone. Walmart started closing sections down around 10:45. I waited until they turned the lights low in the back and made a half-hearted announcement over the PA. I stood, stretched my legs, and walked out slowly, blinking against the darkness. The Texas air felt different now, warmer, quieter. I didn't know where I was heading next. No couch to crash on. No friend I could call at this hour without shame attaching itself to every word. But I walked, and somewhere between the parking lot lights and the hum of the highway in the distance, I realized something. I wasn't dead. I wasn't done. I was erased, but I could rebuild. And by this time tomorrow, the thing in my hand, the thing they had forgotten even existed, would begin to write a story none of them could control. I kept walking after that thought settled, the parking lot lights shrinking behind me as the night thinned into early morning. At some point, the darkness softened, and the sky shifted from deep blue to a washed-out gray. I didn't remember lying down, but I woke up on a patch of grass just off the highway, my back stiff and my clothes carrying the smell of air vents and dust. For a few seconds, I didn't know where I was. Then, it all returned in one heavy wave, and I wished I could close my eyes again and hold off the day a little longer. Losing your home does something strange to your sense of mourning. It removes the idea of starting fresh. You wake up already behind. I pushed myself upright, brushed dirt from my shirt, and walked toward a small public park nearby, one with a few benches, a water fountain that barely worked, and trees that offered only a sliver of shade. I sat on the bench farthest from the road, listening to traffic roll past. People headed to work, people headed somewhere. I wasn't sure what I was headed toward. When you lose your documents in this country, you don't just lose paperwork. You lose access to the systems that confirm you exist. No ID means no applications, no housing, no consistent work. You become someone nobody can verify. I sat there thinking about how carefully my parents had pulled that rug out from under me. Not an impulsive argument, a removal, a quiet rewrite of my place in the world. For the first time, I wondered if they hadn't just pushed me aside. They might have wanted me completely erased. The morning warmed, and with it came a familiar ache in my chest. I thought of Grandma Edith. She was the one person who never treated me like a burden. She used to sit with me on her porch swing and say, "Gentleness isn't weakness, Rhett. It's strength nobody taught your parents to value." She also said silence can be powerful if you choose when to break it. I didn't understand that as a boy. I think I started to that morning. Her memory pressed harder on me the longer I sat there. Loss has its own timing. It settles heavier when you're alone, and it hits with more force when you're out of options. I reached into my pocket, expecting only the rusty key she'd given me years ago, but my fingers brushed something else, something soft, wrapped in a bit of old cloth. I pulled it out slowly. It was the card she pressed into my hand the day before she passed. Worn, a little bent at the corners. Not a credit card, not a gift card. Something older. Something she'd handled so often that the edges had lost their shape. She once told me, "Some doors open only when the world tells you there aren't any left." I used to think she was being poetic. Sitting on that bench, it felt more like instruction. I held it up, letting the sunlight catch the faint markings on the front. The numbers were faded, almost rubbed smooth. The magnetic strip looked like it had survived decades of friction. I turned it over again and again, trying to remember the exact tone of her voice when she said not to use it until I'd been pushed out. "Well," I muttered under my breath, "I guess this morning qualifies." Curiosity cut through the exhaustion in a small but steady way. It wasn't hope, not outright. More like an opening in the fog. Maybe this card connected to something she kept quiet her whole life. Maybe it was nothing. But it was the only direction I had, and sometimes adults rebuild their lives not with certainty but with the first faint thread of possibility. I slipped the card back into my pocket beside the key. 2 small items, both given by the same woman. Both carried for reasons I hadn't understood until now. Having them on me felt steadier than anything else I'd held in the past 24 hours. As I stood, brushing the dirt from my jeans, I remembered a branch of her bank about 3 miles away. She trusted that bank with everything. If the card meant anything, that's where I'd have to start. The walk would be long, and I hadn't eaten, and I still had only a single dollar to my name. But for the first time since being pushed out, my steps were guided by something other than survival. I crossed the park slowly, then followed the sidewalk toward town, listening to the hum of the highway grow quieter behind me. The sun climbed higher, warming my shoulders, making the morning feel less like a punishment and more like a test. I didn't know what the card would reveal, or if anyone at the bank would even take me seriously. But not knowing felt worse than walking the miles to find out. By the time I reached the first intersection, I felt a shift inside me, small but real. Direction. It had been a long time since I'd felt that. Maybe the card was just a relic from her past. Maybe it was something more. Either way, I wasn't moving blind anymore. I headed toward the bank, unaware that the next few hours would pull me straight into a world my grandmother had kept hidden. One that would change the story my family thought they controlled. Walking toward the bank that morning felt different from any walk I'd taken in years. The air still held a bit of coolness from the early light, and my legs were stiff from the miles behind me, but something steadier pushed me forward. I kept the worn card in my hand, the edges soft from age, as though holding it kept my thoughts from drifting too far into doubt. Downtown Lubbock wasn't far now. I could see the taller buildings rising up from the flatter stretch of road, and with every step I felt more like someone returning to a place that no longer recognized him. By the time I reached the first traffic light, the sidewalks had begun to fill with people heading to work. Clean shirts, fresh coffee, easy conversations. I didn't match the rhythm around me, and I knew it. But I also knew I couldn't turn back. The bank stood half a block away, glass front, brick sides, the kind of building you'd pass 100 times without thinking twice. Today, though, it looked like a gatekeeper. Whether it opened or closed on me would decide the shape of everything that came next. My stomach tightened as I stepped through the sliding doors. The lobby was quiet, cool, almost too polished compared to the miles I'd walked. A couple of older folks sat in chairs near the windows, leafing through brochures. The teller at the counter greeted me with a practiced smile, and I felt the familiar pinch of self-consciousness about how I must look. Wrinkled clothes, dust on my shoes, eyes that hadn't seen rest, but pride was a luxury I couldn't afford. Not today. I held out the card. I need help figuring out what this is. Her expression didn't shift at first, but her pause was long enough to register. She nodded, excused herself, and slipped behind a door marked Staff Only. I stood there waiting, trying not to read into anything, though something in my chest tightened the longer she stayed back there. A man in a dark suit eventually stepped out, mid-50s, composed, the kind of person who carried authority without trying. He introduced himself as the branch manager and asked if I'd follow him. I did, into an office with a polished desk and framed certificates on the wall. "Let's take a look at that card," he said. I handed it over, watching him insert it into a reader. The screen flickered, loaded, then filled with numbers and text I couldn't make out from where I sat. But I didn't need to. His face told me everything, his jaw tightening, his eyes widening, just enough to betray the crack in his composure. He stood abruptly. "Stay here, please." Before I could ask anything, he stepped out and locked the office door behind him. For a moment, I just sat there, unsure whether to breathe or freeze. Locked inside an office, no explanations, no hint of whether this was good or bad. Through the glass, I watched him talk to two staff members with a seriousness I didn't expect. One lifted a phone. Another pulled down the blinds at the front of the building. It didn't feel real. A voice in the back of my mind, my father's, echoed some old line about how I never had anything worth holding on to. He said it so often it had become a script he relied on. Seeing a room full of people reacting like this to something connected to me made that memory feel strangely small. The manager returned after a few tense minutes. He sat across from me, folded his hands, and asked me to confirm my identity, quietly, carefully. Then he asked if I knew what the card was. I told him I didn't. He turned the monitor toward me. The number on the screen wasn't something a person expects to see on a random morning, especially not after being kicked out of their house with a single dollar. $3.2 billion. The breath caught in my throat. My grandmother, who'd lived in a weathered little home, who reused jars and never wasted a coupon, had left behind a fortune I never knew existed. My voice barely worked. This has to be a mistake." "It isn't," he said. "And when an account of this size is accessed unexpectedly, protocols require us to ensure your safety." I frowned, confused, until he added, "People have been kidnapped for far less than this. You may be at risk." He wasn't calling for police to arrest me. He was calling them to protect me. That realization hit something inside me I didn't even know was sore. For the first time since my parents pushed me out, someone looked at me as if I mattered, enough to safeguard, enough to worry about. Once the initial procedures calmed, the manager reached into a drawer and set a sealed envelope in front of me. "This was left for you," he said. "Your grandmother instructed us to deliver it only when this card was used." My pulse kicked up again. I opened the envelope with careful fingers. Inside was a thumb drive, no note, no explanation beyond her handwriting on the outside. "For Rhett, when he's ready." I asked if there was a place to view it. He guided me to a small conference room and connected it to a laptop. A video loaded. There she was, Grandma Edith, sitting in her living room. The same throw blanket draped behind her, the same worn sweater she knitted in every winter. Her voice, warm and gentle, filled the room. She said she knew the family treated me differently, saw the cracks forming long before I did. She said she'd built this fortune quietly for decades, through investments she never spoke about. And she said she wasn't giving it to me to make me powerful. She was giving it to free me. "So you won't ever need anyone who never chose to need you back," she said. I watched the video twice. The first time I barely breathed. The second time I felt something steady settle in my chest. Grief, yes, but also clarity. Love has strange ways of outliving the people who gave it. Sometimes it hides in old sweaters, sometimes in vaults, sometimes in the one memory you didn't realize was carrying you. When the video ended, I sat there for a long moment, letting the quiet hold me. The manager came back and asked how I wanted to proceed. It was the first time anyone had asked me that in longer than I could remember. I didn't answer right away. I needed to understand what I was holding, what it meant for me, and what it would mean for the people who had decided I was disposable. I walked out of the conference room with the envelope in my hand and a different weight in my steps. The fortune was shocking, but it wasn't the revelation that changed me. It was her voice, what she saw in me that I hadn't seen in myself. I walked back into the bank's lobby, holding the envelope, the thumb drive tucked safely inside. Something about the light coming through the front windows felt different now, like it wasn't just illuminating the space, but revealing things that had been hiding in plain sight. The manager stood near the counter, waiting. He handed me a folder containing temporary documents, instructions for secure access, and, surprisingly, his personal number. "In case anything feels off," he said, "even a little." I nodded, thanked him, and stepped out into the Texas afternoon. The sun had climbed higher, heating the sidewalk, casting sharper shadows. It wasn't comforting, not exactly, but it was clear, honest, like the world finally had edges I could see. I walked for a few blocks without direction, letting the envelope in my hand ground me. I passed storefronts I barely remembered, half paying attention to the traffic, until I spotted a small diner tucked between a pharmacy and a pawn shop. The neon sign buzzed faintly over the glass door. Miller's Lunch and Coffee. I pushed inside. Cool air hit me, along with the smell of bacon grease and burnt toast. A waitress glanced up, offered a tired smile, and gestured toward the counter. "Anywhere's fine, hun." I slid onto a stool and looked at the menu for show. My stomach was a knot, but I needed something warm, Something simple. Just black coffee and oatmeal, I said. Plain. Even with a card that represented more money than I could wrap my head around, I still ordered like a man with $1. Because this morning, that's exactly who I was. The coffee came first, sharp and bitter, but it steadied me. The oatmeal followed, too thick, barely sweetened. I didn't mind. My mind was elsewhere. Grandma Edith's voice echoed in my memory. Not the recording, though that would stay with me forever, but the way she used to talk when we sat on her porch in the evenings. Calm, patient, never hurried, never loud. She'd warned me in her own way. She saw them for what they were long before I was ready to see it. Her video wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. She gave me the kind of freedom that doesn't need to scream. Halfway through the oatmeal, my phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. Her voice, my mother's, was soft, almost like a whisper, fragile, full of the kind of sweetness that didn't belong to the woman who'd shoved a crumpled dollar into my hand and slammed the door behind me. Rhett, honey, we overreacted. Things got heated. I didn't mean for it to go like that. You know how families get, emotional. I didn't say anything, just listened. She continued, tone rehearsed, careful. This doesn't have to be the end of us. We can fix it. We're still family. I let the silence stretch. Then I heard the faint shift as the phone was passed. My father's voice came next, rough, deliberate. Son, I tried to talk to you last night. Practically begged you to stay. You stormed off. That's not on us. A lie so big it almost made me laugh. We're worried about you, he added. Truly. And this thing with Grandma, her stuff. Maybe it's best we talk about it together. As a family. There it was. The slip. The moment they showed their hand. They didn't know exactly what she left me, but they knew it mattered, and they wanted it back under their roof, controlled, owned. I ended the call without a word. Let the screen go dark. I stared at the half-eaten oatmeal, appetite gone. For a long time, I would have folded right here, walked back, made excuses, told myself they meant well, that they were scared. That love looked different in some families. But now, I heard her voice louder than theirs. Strength isn't always noise. Sometimes it's the choice not to engage. I paid the bill in cash, thanked the waitress, and stepped out into the street. A few feet away, I paused and pulled out the card the bank manager gave me, with the number of a lawyer he trusted. Someone who'd helped clients navigate complicated inheritances and messy family disputes. I dialed. Benjamin Ross, the voice answered, clipped and professional. I explained everything. My identity, the missing documents, the forced eviction, the unexpected inheritance, my family's sudden change in tone. He didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he said, "Okay. First, we get your personal documentation filed for emergency retrieval. Next, we freeze anything they might have accessed, property transfers, bank activity. If they used your name or identity for anything financial, we'll find it." He asked for the bank manager's name. I gave it. They'd worked together before, apparently. "I'll draft an affidavit today," he added. "Once you sign it, we move forward. But starting now, no more phone calls with them. Everything goes through me." Even hearing those words, "everything goes through me," felt like armor. I checked my email from my phone. Within 10 minutes, the first legal document arrived. The subject line alone: affidavit, fraudulent eviction, financial misuse, undue influence, felt like a door clicking shut behind me. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't reacting. I was planning. Walking down the sidewalk, the late afternoon sun sharp against the pavement, I understood something that felt new. I hadn't changed, but what I was willing to tolerate had. The man they pushed out, pockets empty, was the same man now staring down the storm, but this time I had truth on my side, proof, and the law. And that changed everything. My phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. Probably them. Maybe a sibling this time. Maybe my cousin Jessica with her sweet little fake voice. Rhett, I had no idea what happened. I'm so sorry. Always just in time to stay on the right side of the inheritance line, I let it ring. They didn't know the documents were already in motion. They didn't know the bank manager had locked the office door for me. And they sure as hell didn't know about the contents of that thumb drive. I took a slow breath, feeling the envelope shift in my pocket as I moved toward the edge of the block. The heat pressed in, but it didn't weigh on me. Not anymore. Now. The next move belonged to me. By early evening, the warmth of the Texas sun had started to taper off, leaving behind a dry, restless heat that clung to the sidewalks like unfinished business. I had spent the past few hours in motion, walking, talking with the lawyer again, reading the affidavit twice, and checking that the thumb drive was still exactly where I left it. I wasn't paranoid. I was aware. That's the difference between fear and preparation. Around 6:30, my phone vibrated. It was Jace, my brother. The message was short. We're having a family meeting. Get here in 10. No hello, no request, no pretense. I stared at the screen a long second. Family meeting used to mean I sat on the couch while everyone else decided how to explain my next punishment. It wasn't an invitation, it was a summons. And I had always shown up on time, head down, trying to make peace with people who had no intention of offering any. I didn't reply, but I went. Not for them. For the lawyer who had emphasized document their behavior, especially the kind they think no one sees. And I went for myself. Because some moments need to be seen with new eyes, just to make sure you're not romanticizing the past out of habit. The neighborhood looked the same, which almost annoyed me. Same sagging mailbox, same cracked curb. But as I parked across the street, something shifted. The porch light was already on. So were two others down the street. People were outside, not gathered, but hovering. Not close enough to accuse them of watching, but too close to pretend they weren't. I stepped out and stood by the car door for a beat. Something wasn't right. The air felt still in the way it does just before a public mess gets made. Then I saw her, my mother. She stepped onto the porch, hands folded in front of her like a politician before a camera. "There he is," she said, loud enough to carry across the lawn. "The ungrateful one." I didn't move. Then my father followed, voice deeper, rougher, just as calculated. Running off with what doesn't belong to him, always playing the victim. It wasn't a family meeting. It was a setup. Twist the story. Take control of the narrative. Make me look like the unstable one in front of neighbors who'd maybe only heard half whispers behind curtains. And they weren't done. Jace walked forward holding a large plastic garbage bag. He ripped it open and dumped the contents onto the grass. Old clothes, my beat-up leather boots, a cracked phone case, a faded t-shirt I used to sleep in. "We packed your stuff," he said. "You don't get to come inside until you give back what you took." From somewhere down the street, I heard a neighbor whisper, "Is that the kid they threw out this morning?" That word, kid, stuck. I wasn't a kid. I was the man they underestimated one too many times. I stood still, letting the scene play out a few seconds longer. My heart didn't race. My breath didn't falter. Because now I wasn't reacting. I was observing. This wasn't about stuff. It wasn't even about money. It was about control. About reducing me in front of a familiar crowd. The same one they'd spent years performing for. If they couldn't own me anymore, they'd humiliate me instead. I felt something shift deep in my chest. A quiet kind of click, like the final snap in a lock coming undone. Enough. I took one step forward. My father squared up like he expected me to plead. My mother lifted her chin, prepared to speak again, but I didn't look at either of them. I turned to the neighbors, those leaning against their mailboxes, standing near porches, pretending they weren't watching, and I said calmly, "Before anyone decides who's right here, just know this. This morning, they shoved $1 into my hand and threw me out, knowing my grandmother died yesterday." Murmurs. One woman across the street lowered her phone like she'd just realized she'd been filming. "And now," I continued, "they're calling it a misunderstanding." I reached into my jacket. My father tensed, like I might be pulling something more dangerous than a phone. I held up the new device the bank issued and scrolled to the saved video. No theatrics, no build-up. I just hit play. Grandma Edith's voice filled the air. "I'm leaving these things to Rhett because he's the only one they haven't managed to break." Silence. Not awkward, not tense, just full. My mother's expression cracked, lips parting, eyes darting like a kid caught cheating. I didn't give her time to speak. I pulled out the folded affidavit, held it high enough for everyone to see the header. "This is a legal notice," I said. "What happens next will be handled through proper channels, including your attempt to remove me from this home and access funds that don't belong to you." My father took a half step forward. "You wouldn't dare." "You already dared first," I said flatly. That's when the neighbors moved, just subtly. A few stepped back. One crossed her arms. Another turned fully toward me, like something in the air had shifted and they needed to realign. The power changed hands. Not because I yelled, not because I fought, but because the truth doesn't need a stage. It only needs to be said out loud, once, with no apology. Then Jace smirked, and I knew we weren't done. He stepped forward and said, "You think you've got all the cards, huh?" I didn't answer. He reached into his jacket pocket. "You think you're ready, but you have no idea what we found." The second Jace said it, the air around us shifted, dense, heavy, like the street itself stopped breathing. I felt it before I even saw what he was pulling from his jacket. A manila envelope, thick at the seams. Not the kind used for love letters or receipts. This was the kind you handed to a lawyer, or worse, a reporter. Mom's voice cut in, a sharp whisper not meant to be discreet. "Not here, Jace. Don't show him here." But it was too late. He wanted an audience, and he had one. He stepped forward with all the swagger of someone convinced he held the kill shot and shoved the envelope into my hands. "Go ahead," he said, "since you're all about the truth now." I opened it, slowly. Inside were printed screenshots, dozens of them. At first, I thought maybe they dug into my old social accounts, found something embarrassing or out of context. But it wasn't that. It was worse. Far worse. The first page was a message supposedly from me to our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Lantry, claiming I'd borrowed $200 and refused to pay it back. The second was a conversation that looked like I'd accused my own mother of hiding loan documents. The third suggested I forged signatures on estate paperwork, pointing fingers at my own father. All fake, all written in my name. Jace raised his voice just enough to let the neighbors hear. We figured folks around here deserve to know who they've really been living next to. My father chimed in, all mock concern. And if he starts dragging more people into his mess, they should know who they're dealing with. A few neighbors leaned in. One lady across the street even pulled out her phone. This was it. Not just a public embarrassment. This was character assassination, methodically planned. The kind of thing that sticks long after it's disproven. The kind of lie that poisons you quietly while everyone smiles politely and avoids eye contact at the grocery store. I didn't speak. I didn't rip the pages. I didn't defend myself. Because in that moment, I knew defending myself would be like trying to wash ink off a sponge with a wet rag. It'd just make the stain worse. I heard a whisper behind me. He always did keep to himself. Another, guess the money's already going to his head. And that's what hurt more than the lies. The fact that the seed of suspicion had already been planted. My family hadn't just turned on me tonight. They'd been fertilizing this narrative for years. The quiet one, the difficult son, the one who didn't come to church last Easter. And now, with just a handful of fake texts, they could tip the whole town into believing the rest. I tucked the envelope under my arm, turned around, and walked back to my car. No raised voice, no final word. Because adults know, when people want to believe something bad about you, they will. And arguing only makes you look desperate. My hands trembled as I turned the ignition, not out of fear, but from the clarity that comes when someone crosses a line so deep, they can't ever come back from it. I didn't drive straight home. I drove to the one person who had no skin in the game, my attorney. The lights were still on in his office when I pulled into the parking lot a half hour later. Papers were stacked across his desk and his tie had been loosened, like he'd already been preparing for a late night. He looked up as I walked in and saw the envelope in my hand. "They've escalated," I said, handing it over. He read silently for about 2 minutes, flipping through the pages without expression. Then he leaned back and sighed. "This," he said, "isn't amateur work." What does that mean? It means they didn't just whip this up out of panic tonight. It was planned, coordinated, probably timed for right after you made your move. I sat down across from him, my voice quiet but even. And that's not the worst part, is it? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled a separate folder from his drawer. "I started digging into land records," he said, "checking to see if your name appeared on any other filings." He laid 3 documents in front of me. Property deeds, all dated last year. Grandma's land, her second rental house, and a small parcel I didn't even know she owned behind the county line. None of them listed my parents. None listed Jace, but they all listed the same company. A shell corporation formed 6 months after my grandmother's first stroke. He flipped to the final page and tapped the signature line. My name, but it wasn't my handwriting. Not even close. A perfect imitation. Enough to pass to a bank or a judge. And suddenly it was clear. This hadn't been a family pushing out their wayward son. It was a heist, and I was the scapegoat. "They used me," I said quietly. "They signed everything over using my name, and now they're trying to erase me so I can't point back to them." The attorney nodded. "Exactly. If this is what it looks like, it's criminal fraud. And this is the kind of case that makes noise." I stared at the forged signature again. It had the confidence of someone who'd been doing it for a while, someone who knew I wouldn't be checking because I was too busy being discarded. They didn't pick me because I was weak, I said. They picked me because I was silent. He looked up. What do you want to do next? And right then, something inside me settled. Not vengeance, not rage, just purpose. I want to expose it, all of it. He nodded, sliding a notepad across the desk. Then let's begin. I walked out into the night with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't confidence, it was direction. The kind that settles into your spine and tells you there's no turning back. The attorney's instructions replayed quietly in my mind as I drove. Let them speak. Let them reveal their intent. Record everything. His voice stayed with me the entire way. By the time I neared the neighborhood, the sky had darkened into a muted blue. Most porch lights had switched off, leaving the street still and private. Yet my family's house burned bright, every light on, shadows pacing behind the curtains. They were preparing, arguing, revising the plan they thought would corner me. I parked a few houses down, giving myself a moment to breathe. I pressed the record button on my phone and tucked it into my shirt like the attorney had shown me. The night air felt heavy as I walked toward the porch. One knock, firm, quiet. My mother opened the door, her expression startled for a split second before she smoothed it over with the kind of politeness she used on guests. My father hovered behind her, stiff and uneasy. Jace leaned against the hallway wall, arms crossed, wearing the smug look of someone who believes he's already secured the final move. They invited me inside with a warmth so rehearsed it almost echoed. "We want peace, honey," my mother murmured, touching my arm. Peace from them had always meant silence from me. But tonight, I gave them something different, something they mistook as surrender. I let my shoulders dip, let my voice soften. "I don't want to fight anymore," I said quietly, letting the line hang just long enough. My father stepped forward immediately. "Then bring us what Edith gave you. We'll manage it as a family." I nodded, as though the idea didn't unsettle me. "I can do that, but I need to understand why you made those decisions." There, the hook. And as the attorney predicted, they swarmed to take the bait. They started explaining themselves, each trying to justify choices they'd already convinced themselves were reasonable. My mother talked about protecting the family's future. My father claimed Grandma's judgment had been slipping. Jace chimed in with how necessary adjustments had been made, how it was all for stability. They didn't realize their own words were constructing a timeline of forged transfers, misused authority, coordinated deceit. My phone captured every sentence, every contradiction. Then Jace leaned back, too comfortable, too sure of himself. "You weren't supposed to see any of the paperwork," he said. "And those signatures? Honestly, we probably saved you from making mistakes." My mother shot him a look, but the damage was done. I lifted my head. My posture straightened, and for the first time since I stepped inside, their expressions shifted. They sensed the change. "I appreciate your honesty," I said. Their relief lasted half a second. I pulled out the documents the attorney had shown me. The forged deeds, the shell company filings, the transfers they swore I signed. I placed them gently on the coffee table. Then I tapped the playback on my phone. Their voices echoed through the room, exposing intent they could never take back. My father's face drained. My mother covered her mouth. Jace stepped forward but stopped when I raised a hand. "The attorney has copies," I said. "The bank has copies. And after tonight, So will the court. A stillness washed over the room, the kind that comes when the truth finally arrives and refuses to leave. I expected triumph. Instead, I felt a deep, steady sadness. Years of trying to earn a place in a home that was built on shifting sand. Years of believing I was the fragile link when, in reality, I had simply been the easiest one to use. I'm done carrying your secrets, I said softly. My father reached outward, more pleading than forceful. You don't understand what this will do. I understand exactly, I answered. And you ended this long before I did. My mother whispered, barely audible, Please, don't destroy us. I walked to the door, my hand on the knob, the weight of the night settling into something final. Tomorrow, the law would decide what I could not fix, and what they could never bury again. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was worried, something deeper. Like my mind already knew a chapter was closing, and the silence before dawn was letting me walk through it one last time. I was up before the sun. The house was quiet, my small apartment still smelling like new paint and second-hand wood. I stood in the kitchen with a cup of weak coffee, staring at the folder on the table. Inside, it was everything. Paperwork, audio, copies of what I'd fought to gather. My hands moved steadily, not rushed, not angry, just ready. Ready in a way that had nothing to do with vengeance, and everything to do with ending something that had taken too much from me for too long. The courthouse in Lubbock sits near the center of town, square and heavy-looking, like it was built to hold stories that got too loud. I parked across the street, locked my car, and walked toward the entrance, folder tucked under my arm. The steps felt heavier than usual, not because I feared the outcome, but because I understood the cost. My attorney was already waiting in the corridor inside, dressed in the same calm gray suit he wore last night. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. One nod from him was enough. We walked to the clerk's window, handed over the folder, and began. The clerk flipped through the papers, stamping each page with a dull thud that sounded too loud in that quiet room. Fraudulent property transfers, forged signatures, audio recordings, digital impersonation. Every page left my hand and landed in the system, piece by piece. No raised voices, no declarations, just procedure. Most people think justice arrives like thunder. But in real life, it's more like slow rainfall, quiet, steady, not always noticeable until everything beneath it starts to shift. It didn't take long. By late morning, we were notified that a temporary court order had been issued. Every asset linked to the shell company was frozen. Investigators had already begun making contact with my parents. Jace had been served. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need to. Outside the courthouse, I sat on a bench, watching the traffic move in slow waves. The morning air was crisp, with that Texas sharpness that bites just a little. I sat there for a long time, not thinking about what came next, but just letting the weight lift. I thought justice would feel like victory. It didn't. It felt like the first full breath I'd taken in years. Honest air, unfiltered. Back at the attorney's office, he laid out next steps like a surgeon before an operation. Depositions, hearings, timelines. I listened, nodded, asked the questions I knew I needed to ask. But part of me had already stepped into something quieter. The fight wasn't over, not legally. But something inside had shifted. The need to prove myself, to fix their broken version of who I was, that part felt like it was finally dissolving. You know, the attorney said as I was leaving, It'll take time. But what you did last night, that was the beginning of something rare. I thanked him and left. By evening, I was back at my apartment. The furniture still didn't match. The windows were too thin. The floors creaked. But it was mine. I placed Grandma Edith's card on the small table by the window. The edges were even more worn now. I didn't care. I opened it again just to see her handwriting one more time. That familiar line stared back at me. You are enough, Rhett. And one day, you'll see it. The morning she died, those words felt like a lifeline. Tonight, they felt like a mirror. I pulled out the envelope she left, the one with her final message. I opened it and read it again, slowly this time, word for word. Not looking for clues, just for connection. I don't know what justice will look like in the end. Courtrooms don't fix everything, but I know this. For the first time, I'm not defined by the lies my family told. They may never apologize. They might carry their anger to the grave, but their silence will no longer shape my worth. The wounds are still there, but they no longer speak louder than I do. Some stories don't end with reconciliation, but they can end with freedom.